everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is about the famous Gothic novel Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. The main conflict in the story is about a love relation that was not allowed to happen because of social barriers. Because the main character is poor and has no family connections and comes from an unknown background, whereas the love interest comes from a wealthy family. This class-based exclusion drives the main character to be obsessed with gaining control over everything and everyone. So there is also this aspect of revenge that creates a lot of the book's main events. The story is told from the perspective of a man called Mr. Lookwood, who comes to rent and stay at Thrushcross Grange. We don't know what business he has there, but we learn a lot about the story of the man who owns this place through Mr. Lookwood's perspective. Heathcliff is the main character of the story, and he owns the place where Mr. Lookwood will be staying. Our first impressions of Wuthering Heights is Mr. Lookwood's first impressions. You get a feeling that it's a very dark and gloomy place. It's a manor with narrow windows in a very windy location on top of a hill, surrounded by bent trees and thorny grass. It was first owned by the Earnshaw family, who adopted Heathcliff as a young boy. Our narrator, Mr. Lookwood, learns a lot about the story from other people like Nellie, who used to work at both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. She worked there all her life and she knows all the details. So the man who adopted Heathcliff was Mr. Earnshaw, who is the father of Catherine and Hindley. Heathcliff is described as a gypsy child with black hair, ragged and dirty, and spoke gibberish. Heathcliff grows up with Catherine, who is very much attracted to his wild nature. They behave like children, and even when they grow up, they still act wildly. Mr. Earnshaw loves Heathcliff even more than he loves his own son, which makes Hindley hate Heathcliff. Catherine is described as free-spirited, beautiful, spoiled and often arrogant, and has no restraint over her temper. Catherine and Heathcliff become inseparable, but Hindley continues to treat Heathcliff cruelly because he just cannot stand seeing everyone loving Heathcliff. Mr. Earnshaw becomes disgusted with the constant conflict between Hindley and Heathcliff, and so he sends Hindley away to college. After their father's death, Hindley returns to Wuthering Heights with his wife, determined to take his revenge on Heathcliff. He declares that Heathcliff will no longer be allowed an education, and instead he will spend his days working in the fields. Time goes on, and because of some circumstances, Catherine meets their neighbor, Edgar Linton, and his family, and she grows to like him. Edgar is a proper gentleman, and she cannot help but compare him to Heathcliff, who is uneducated, uncivilized, and a big part of that is due to the fact that he has long been degraded to the position of a servant. Catherine is torn between her wild passion for Heathcliff and her social ambitions. Edgar Linton is described as being well-bred but rather spoiled, and he grows up to be tender but somewhat cowardly. Edgar's parents teach Catherine to be ladylike, and eventually Catherine accepts Edgar's proposal because she wants to be part of a high society, and Edgar and his family were going to give her that. Now Heathcliff turns into this bitter, angry man, and he has every right to be so. He was the subject of Hindley's mistreatment for years. He was pulled out of his education and was degraded from being the adopted son of Mr. Earnshaw to being a servant in the house. He was ridiculed for his looks not only by Edgar and Hindley, but also by Catherine. She changes on him, even though he remains her childhood love. Heathcliff was miserable for a big length of the story because of her choices and because of his mad love.
You see, I've marked every day.
Very foolish. As if I took notice. Where's the sense in that?
To show that I do take notice.
Oh, I see. Should I always be sitting with you?
Heathcliff turns into a full-fledged villain who swears to make everyone suffer, especially after Catherine's death. He takes his revenge on Hindley, who loses all his money and has to sell Wuthering Heights to Heathcliff, on Hindley's son, whom Heathcliff degrades to the position of a servant, on Catherine and Edgar's daughter, whose name is also Catherine and so much resembles her mother, on Edgar's sister, whom Heathcliff marries, and even on his son with Edgar's sister, who is described as weak and cowardly, which somewhat reminds us of the boy's uncle Edgar. The characters tree is a bit complicated because we have two generations. There is a guide at the beginning of my edition of the book that tells us all the names so that we don't get confused. I believe you can find it online after a quick Google search, but I tried to take a good picture of it for you anyway. I won't say any more about the plot in case you want to read the book. I don't want to spoil it. The story is full of so much details and events. If you're in the mood for reading a dark story, which is a bit spooky and has a love triangle and a morally grey protagonist, then I suggest you read this book. It has gothic elements and unusual social drama. It's almost like a spooky version of a Jane Austen's book. Even the setting of the story seems to have secrets of its own. The description of the place is so eerie, with closed rooms and forgotten corners. The mystery of the land adds a lot to the mystery of the characters themselves, and the physical landscape of the novel is often used to reflect the mental and emotional state of the people living in it. This sense of mystery is established early on in the novel by the appearance of Catherine Earnshaw's ghost. It is not clear whether it's a fragment of Lockwood's imagination or not, because he was half asleep and he was having nightmares. It seems that Emily Bronte intended for this to be a real event in the novel, because Heathcliff refers several times during the course of the novel to Catherine Earnshaw's ghost. So he seems to believe Lockwood. It definitely sets the tone for the rest of the novel. Catherine and Heathcliff's passion for one another is the center of the events of the whole story, because it's stronger than any other feelings that we get from the rest of the characters. As she tells their story, Nellie harshly criticizes both Catherine and Heathcliff for their mad love for one another, calling their passion immoral.
Shame on you. Think of your soul.
Indeed, the kind of love that Heathcliff has for Catherine seems more like a sickness. It was unhealthy on so many levels. It's not easy to decide whether the writer intended for the readers to blame the lovers for all the problems that their love has caused, or to idealize their love as something that transcends social norms.
What does that inscription mean?
Some damnable writing.
Can you believe in the existence of such a colossal dunce? Can't even read.
Martin Earnshaw. My mother's name was Earnshaw.
Didn't you know? Hareton is also your cousin.
The love between young Catherine and Hareton seems to serve as a contrast to the first love relation between Catherine and Heathcliff. The second love relation doesn't seem to be based on strong passion, but rather on understanding and compassion. It involves growth and change, which is why it ends happily and restores back the peace and balance to Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Whereas the first love relation, even though it was much stronger and more profound, it wants to stay young forever and unchanging, thus causes a lot of pain to almost everyone in the story. The hierarchy of the late 18th and early 19th century British society wasn't very different from earlier periods. At the top there was the royalty, followed by the aristocracy, and then the gentry, and at the bottom comes the lower classes who made up the vast majority of the population. Members of the gentry were richer than the lower classes, but they had no titles and their status could change. And there were no rules for whether or not a member of the gentry was seen as a gentleman. It pretty much depended on how wealthy that person was, how much land and servants they had. So this dictated a lot of the characters' motivations, who were all from the gentry and wanted to assert their status in the society, including Heathcliff, who began as a poor orphan. A lot of his revenge was based on depriving the people that persecuted and hurt him from the social armor. So he needed to be rich himself, and the more lands and houses he possessed, the less the people will question his poor beginnings. In his opinion, no one can hurt a man who is rich and powerful. As readers, we can sympathize with his views because we can see how bad things were for him at the beginning. But then he starts to turn cruel, and we start to question not only his sanity, but we even start questioning his hate for the other characters in the first place. Even Heathcliff starts to doubt himself when he realizes that revenge did not bring him happiness. On the contrary, it drained him and left him with an empty feeling. At first he was satisfied to see the others suffering like he did. But then he realizes that all that he did was for the unfulfilled love that remains the one thing that he couldn't get. The style is lyrical and poetic, because Bronte was also a poet. The dark events and the emotional intensity in this novel is very uncommon in novels written in the Victorian era. One of the most important aspects of the novel is the second and third hand narration. The story is told through the entries of Lockwood's diary, but Lockwood does not participate in the events himself. He writes the things that he learned from the testaments of others. There is Catherine's diary, which he reads, and then there is his conversations with Nellie Dean. This creates a distance between the reader and the story itself. So it's very important to remember that the story is told entirely from the perspective of a biased narrator, which is more commonly known as an unreliable narrator. Lockwood knows nothing, so he's only just observing. And Nellie, she knows everything, but we sometimes question her decisions, and that makes us question her truthfulness in telling the story. And because the entire story is narrated through characters, the style changes with the changing of the characters' voices. For instance, we get a feeling that Nellie is biased towards Catherine Earnshaw. She seems to be jealous of her mistress's beauty and wealth. This jealousy is either because both servant and mistress are of the same age and practically grew up together, or because Nellie has feelings for Edgar Linton, who marries Catherine, or even for Heathcliff, who loves no one but Catherine. So you must put in mind that you have to read between the lines to understand almost all the events of the story. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support my channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. My book, Horoscope: The Forces of Nature, is available on Amazon. I will be very much happy to know what you think of it. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.